So we're going to take a closer look now at the particle gradient shader and how that can be used in conjunction with other particle-specific shader nodes. And the particle gradient is basically the same as the texture gradient node, except we've kind of optimized it and customized it for specific particle effects. So the first thing we're going to do is just plug that into the shape input. And one of the first things to mention about the particle gradient node is that it's always evaluating the gradient based on a certain evaluation criteria. So by default, that evaluation criteria is the particle age percentage. So what that means is when we look at the minimum and maximum evaluation range, it means particles at age 0 will evaluate the beginning of the gradient. Particles at age 100% of their life will evaluate the end of the gradient. So if we take the first marker and set this to, say, a red color, take the last marker, set it to something like blue, you can clearly see here the particles are born, they get the red color from the gradient, and as they age and reach 100% of their life, they eventually fade to the blue color. So that also applies to the alpha channel. So if we look at the alpha, what we're saying here is at the beginning of their life, they're transparent. We fade them into an opaque state and then fade them out again. So we can just easily tune this. If we take the beginning marker, make it white, we've made the beginning particles, as soon as they're born, they're 100% opaque, and then we fade into transparency. And if you've looked at the other rendering DVDs, you'll probably have a good idea of how the gradient works. But if not, I'll quickly mention on the top here, we have controls to modulate the actual fading from marker to marker. When we click below, we add a new marker, which we can then set the value of. So fairly straightforward. If we go down here, we've got some particle-specific presets, so we can set it to a black and white mode, a flame kind of look, just to kind of get you started here. I have no idea why the beginning here is blue for a flame, but in any case. And the last one we have is smoke. So you can see here we're just setting the particle color to white. The alpha is just being set to be slightly transparent at the beginning and then fading out. We've got some nice controls down here for keying the markers for the alpha as well as the RGB, as well as removing the keys, and an option to reset the gradient. So I'm just going to set this back to what I had here actually. So like I mentioned, we're evaluating the gradient based on the age percentage criteria by default. What we can do is, and this is essentially how we customize the shading for particles, is by feeding it different inputs to evaluate the gradient on. And keep in mind, all the markers can be fed with different textures and different color nodes, so you can actually create more custom looks. I'm just going to stick with the gradient colors to keep things light and simple. So one of the most useful nodes is the Get Scalar node. And what this does, it basically outputs a lot of different parameters of the particle cloud. So we've got something like the radius, rotation angle, speeds, pressure, density. Let's just set it to radius. So what we can do is plug that into the particle gradient as the eval point. And now what we're saying is when the particle radius is 0, evaluate the initial color, which is red in this case. When the particle radius is 1, evaluate the last color, which is blue in this case. So, for example, when the particles are born, they're red, and they quickly change to blue as they reach a radius of 1, because we have the actual size of the particle animated in the p-type. So as I bring that up, you can see, I think at the very end of their life, particles are about a size of 2. So you can see as they reach the end, they reach that blue color. What we can do is easily flip this around. So if we want the particles to be red at the end and blue at the beginning, but we don't want to change the gradient, we can just swap this evaluation range. So we can set this to 0 and set the minimum here to 2, or approximately 2. So now we're saying when the particle radius is 2, evaluate the beginning. When the radius is 0, evaluate the end. So effectively reverse the gradient now on the particle. So that's all fairly straightforward, and building more advanced render trees is nothing more complex than simply taking some parameter that you're pulling and then modifying it either through math nodes or different other inputs and blending them. And in this way you can create quite complex effects. We'll look at a few scenarios later on, but right now we're just going to stick to some of the basics of the different shader nodes. One thing I want to mention now is the fact that if you actually look on the p-type, you see here we actually set the color and alpha on the p-type, and this is kind of for a quick way to quickly set up your particle how you want. If you're not going to use a gradient, you're just going to use the shape with some noise or texture, this is a good way to quickly set the alpha and the actual color. And again, you can set the color here based on different references. So the RGB and alpha can be set independently based on different criteria here. Sometimes what we want to do is we want to use the actual, say, alpha on the p-type, but evaluate the render tree for the actual color. So there's a very simple node to do that, get color. And if we look at that, we've got two sets of controls here with some overriding controls. So what we can say here is override the particle RGB and override the particle alpha. And so those are both enabled. So when we plug it in to the particle shape input, it's going to fully use this input as a parameter. What we can do is say, I want to use the alpha from the p-type, but use the RGB from the render tree. So right now, it doesn't matter what I set the alpha here to, it's simply evaluating the p-type for the alpha. So we can go ahead and plug the gradient now into the particle color, into the override color port. And so we're evaluating this render tree for the color, but for the alpha, again, we're looking at the p-type. We can easily just change that around. So now we're looking at the p-type for both RGB and alpha. If I just want to use the render tree to drive the alpha, we enable that, and then I can go to the alpha component here and then quickly, adjust some of the alpha settings here. So we can control the transparency this way. So that's a quick look at the particle gradient and some of the shaders that can be used in conjunction with that. We're going to look at more specific examples up next.